The reason you can't stick to anything has nothing to do with discipline. It never did. Somewhere inside you, right now, there's a mechanism deciding, in advance, exactly how many days in a row you're allowed to show up before you quietly sabotage yourself back to zero. You felt it before. That strange pull towards skipping just this once, arriving right on schedule, almost as if something in you was counting. Here's what should genuinely concern you. That pattern isn't random, and it isn't weakness. It's a ceiling installed a long time ago, and it will keep resetting you to the same starting line for the rest of your life, every single time you get close to breaking through it, unless you understand exactly what's enforcing it. Most people never find out. They just keep starting over, year after year, convinced next time will finally be different, never realizing they're colliding with the exact same wall every time, simply wearing a new date. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what that wall is and precisely how to get past it for good. If you've made it this far, it's because you're determined to have a life of success. So I invite you to subscribe to the channel, because every video will help you develop the mindset that attracts wealth, prosperity, and new opportunities every day. Let's talk about that wall directly, because until you understand exactly what it's made of, you'll keep hitting it in the same place, at the same distance, no matter how many times you try again. Marathon runners have a name for a very specific, very real phenomenon that happens somewhere around mile 18 or 20. They call it hitting the wall. The body, having burned through its stored glycogen, suddenly feels like it's running through wet concrete. Legs that were moving fine a mile earlier now feel like they belong to someone else. And here's what almost nobody outside of serious training understands about that wall. It isn't random, and it isn't really about that particular day's weather or effort. It shows up at almost exactly the same point for almost every unprepared runner, because it's not a mystery of willpower. It's math. The body ran out of a specific resource, in a specific place, because nothing was done in advance to prevent it. This is precisely what happens to consistency, and almost nobody describes it this accurately. You don't fail on day 7, or day 12, or day 30, because you suddenly became weaker or lazier than you were the day before. You fail there because something specific ran out, in a specific place, exactly the way glycogen runs out at mile 20 for a runner who never trained for the distance. The wall isn't evidence you're not built for consistency. It's evidence you're human, running out of a supply nobody ever taught you to manage. Here's the resource almost nobody names correctly. It isn't motivation, even though that's what people blame first. Motivation was never meant to carry you the entire distance. It's the burst of energy at the starting line, not the fuel system for the whole race. The actual resource running out is something closer to decision capacity, a genuinely limited tank your mind draws from every single time you have to choose, in the moment, whether to follow through or not. Psychologists sometimes call this decision fatigue, and it behaves exactly like physical glycogen. It depletes with use. It doesn't care how important the decision is. Every single choice, no matter how small, draws from the same shrinking supply. This is why the 7th day of a new habit often feels dramatically harder than the first, even though logically it should be getting easier by then. On day 1, the decision to follow through is fresh, almost effortless, carried by leftover enthusiasm. But every day after that draws down the same tank a little further, and if nothing is done to manage it deliberately, it eventually runs dry at almost the same predictable point for almost everyone, which is exactly why so many people report failing around the same time, every single time they try something new, without ever realizing the timing wasn't a coincidence. Hill studied a version of this exact wall decades before anyone had a clinical name for it, watching men attempt sustained effort and fail, almost always, at a suspiciously similar stage. He didn't conclude they lacked willpower. He concluded the opposite, that the men who actually sustained anything long-term were the ones who'd stopped relying on willpower as fuel at all, replacing it with what he called fixed habits of thought, patterns so deeply rehearsed that following through no longer required a fresh decision every single day. He was describing, in the language available to him, a runner who trained for the distance instead of one who simply hoped enthusiasm would carry them past mile 20. Think about the difference between someone who has to consciously decide, every single morning, whether today is a gym day, weighing the pros and cons fresh each time, and someone for whom going to the gym at 7 a.m. has become so automatic it barely registers as a decision at all, closer to brushing their teeth than to a moral test of character. The first person is burning glycogen every single morning before they've even left the house. The second person built a system that removed the decision entirely, which means there's nothing left to run out. This is the actual difference between people who seem naturally consistent and people who quietly white-knuckle their way through every single day, exhausting themselves at the exact same mile marker, over and over, wondering why the wall keeps appearing in the same place. It was never about who had more willpower. It was about who understood that willpower was never supposed to be the whole race in the first place, and who built something else to carry the weight once it inevitably ran out. So if willpower isn't the fuel that actually sustains consistency, the real question becomes something far more specific and far more useful than how do I want it more? It becomes this: what exactly does someone build instead, and how early in the process does it actually need to be in place before the wall shows up and takes the decision out of your hands entirely? Here's the answer, and it's smaller and less glamorous than most people expect once they finally hear it. What you build instead of willpower is friction removal, deliberately engineering the decision itself out of existence before the moment ever arrives, so there's nothing left for the depleted tank to have to decide. This sounds almost too simple to matter, and that reaction is exactly why most people skip past it looking for something more sophisticated. But think about what actually happens in the specific moment someone abandons a new habit. It's rarely a dramatic collapse of character. It's a tiny, forgettable moment of friction. The gym clothes weren't laid out, so getting dressed felt like one more decision on top of an already depleted day. The book was still in a bag somewhere, so reading felt like a small expedition instead of an easy default. None of these moments look significant while they're happening, but each one draws directly from the exact supply that was already running low, and on the day that supply finally hits empty, even a small amount of friction is enough to end the whole thing. Hill placed heavy emphasis on the importance of a definite, organized plan rather than vague intention alone, insisting that a goal without a specific, structured path to follow burns far more mental energy than people realize, simply figuring out what to do next at every single step. He wasn't talking about friction in the modern sense, but he was pointing at exactly the same mechanism. Every moment spent deciding what comes next is a moment not spent actually doing it, and that gap, repeated daily, is precisely where consistency quietly dies. Think about the difference between two people trying to build the same habit of writing every morning. One of them decides, generally, that they're going to start writing more. Each morning, they have to figure out where, when, on what, for how long, using which tool, in the middle of an already busy start to the day. Every single one of those tiny decisions costs something from the same limited reserve, and by day 9 or 10, there's often nothing left to spend on actually deciding to sit down and write it all. The other person removed every one of those decisions in advance. The notebook is already on the kitchen table, open to a blank page, sitting exactly where the coffee gets made. The time is already fixed, 6:15, immediately after the coffee finishes brewing, no negotiation required. There's no decision left to make. There's only a cue, already connected to an action, running the same way a habit runs once it's actually installed. This is the specific difference between a goal and a system, and it's worth being precise about why the distinction matters so much more than people initially assume. A goal lives entirely in the future, which means every single day requires a fresh act of will to move toward it. A system lives in the present, structured so specifically that very little willpower is required to execute it, because most of the actual decisions were already made once in advance, during a moment when the supply was full and thinking clearly was still cheap. Picture a man who's tried, for separate times over 3 years, to build a consistent habit of reviewing his finances weekly, always starting with real intention, always abandoning it within a month. What finally worked wasn't more motivation. It was moving the entire task to Sunday morning specifically, before anything else on his calendar, with the exact spreadsheet already open and bookmarked, coffee already part of the ritual, no decision left except the one that had already been made in advance: sit down, because that's simply what Sunday morning now means. The friction that used to quietly kill the habit around week 3 simply isn't there anymore to kill anything. Here's what makes this principle so easy to underestimate. It doesn't feel dramatic enough to be the actual answer. People want the secret to consistency to be some deep psychological insight, some profound reframe of their identity. Sometimes that matters too, and we'll get to it. But underneath almost every failed habit is something embarrassingly practical, a decision that had to be remade under depleted conditions that never should have had to be made fresh in the first place. This raises the next honest question, though, because friction removal alone doesn't explain everything. Some people remove every possible obstacle, build the perfect system, eliminate every decision in advance, and still fail, for a reason that has nothing to do with friction at all. There's a second failure point almost nobody accounts for, and it shows up precisely when the system is working perfectly and life still finds a way to interrupt it anyway. Here's the second failure point, and it's the one that catches even people who did everything right up to this moment. Life interrupts. It always will. A sick kid, a canceled flight, a brutal week at work that eats every spare hour you'd planned around. The system was perfect. The friction was removed. And then, one Tuesday, reality simply didn't cooperate, and the streak broke anyway. This is where most people make a mistake so common it barely registers as a mistake anymore. It just feels like the natural, inevitable end of every attempt at consistency they've ever made. The streak breaks, and instead of picking the system back up the very next day, something else happens. A missed Monday becomes a missed week, which quietly becomes a missed month, which eventually becomes another entry on the long list of things that just didn't work out this time. The interruption itself was never actually the problem. What happened after the interruption was, go back to the marathon for a moment. Even elite runners occasionally slow to a walk for a few hundred meters, a cramp, a rough patch, a moment where the body simply needs less than a full sprint. That walking stretch doesn't disqualify them from the race. It's not the end of the run. It's a few hundred meters inside a race that's still 26 miles long. The only version of that moment that actually ends the race is the runner deciding, mid-walk, that walking now means they were never a real runner to begin with, and simply stepping off the course. The walk was never the problem. The story told about the walk was, missing one day of a habit, on its own, barely moves the needle on any real outcome. One skipped workout doesn't undo months of consistency. One skipped morning of writing doesn't erase the skill being built. The actual damage almost never comes from the missed day itself. It comes from the story a person tells themselves about what that missed day means. The quiet, automatic leap from, I missed today, to, I'm clearly not someone who does this. A conclusion that arrives so fast it rarely even feels like a conclusion. It feels like simple fact. Think about what happens to someone 3 weeks into a new habit who loses an entire Wednesday to a genuine family emergency, no fault of their own. If Thursday morning arrives and the first thought is some version of C, this is exactly what always happens. That sentence rarely feels dramatic in the moment. It feels like an obvious, almost boring observation about how things always go. And because it feels obvious rather than chosen, it goes completely unquestioned. Thursday gets skipped too, then Friday, And within 2 weeks, the entire habit has quietly dissolved, blamed on life getting busy, rather than on the story that filled the gap where Wednesday used to be. The alternative isn't complicated, and that's exactly what makes it so easy to underestimate. Thursday morning, the same small action just happens again, unceremoniously, treating Wednesday as exactly what it was, one missed day, already behind them, carrying no authority over what Thursday gets to be. Here's the part worth sitting with honestly, because it reframes almost everything people believe about what actually derails consistency. It was never really about whether the interruption happens. It always will, for absolutely everyone, no matter how well-designed the system is. The real determining factor is how quickly someone returns to the system once the interruption passes. Not with punishment, not with an elaborate plan to make up for the missed time, just a plain, uneventful return to the exact same small action as soon as the very next opportunity allows it. If something about this is landing for you right now, if you can already picture a specific streak you abandoned after one missed day turned into a story about who you are, I want you to do something small before we go further. Write the words "I am abundant" in the comments below, not as decoration, as a signal that the next missed day, whenever it inevitably comes, gets treated as data instead of a verdict. The people who take this small, specific step are the ones who actually return to their own systems the next day, instead of letting one bad Wednesday quietly write the ending for the rest of the story. Because there's still a deeper question underneath all of this, one that goes beyond systems and missed days entirely. Why some people return effortlessly after an interruption, while others, even understanding everything we've just covered, still can't seem to make themselves pick the thread back up. Here's the honest answer, and it has almost nothing to do with the missed day itself. It has to do with what the habit was actually attached to underneath the surface. Because two people can build the exact same system, using the exact same friction removal, and one of them returns effortlessly after an interruption while the other simply never does, for a reason that was buried the entire time beneath both of their routines. Go back to the marathon one more time. Two runners can follow the identical training plan, the identical nutrition strategy, the identical pacing chart. But only one of them, somewhere around mile 20, has a specific reason burned into their mind for why finishing actually matters. A promise made to someone, a version of themselves they're finally proving something to, a picture of crossing that line that they can see in exact detail. The other runner trained just as hard, technically, but never built that specific picture. When the wall hits both of them at the same mile marker, the runner with nothing concrete underneath the effort has far less pulling them through it than the one who does. The training was identical. What each of them was actually running toward was not. This is where Hill's insistence on emotional intensity actually earns its place in this conversation, not as decoration, but as the literal difference between a habit that survives an interruption and one that quietly dies at the first opportunity. He was specific that a definite purpose, held without real emotional weight behind it, functions closer to a suggestion than an instruction. The subconscious mind, in his description, doesn't organize itself around things merely noted. It organizes itself around things that actually matter enough to generate real feeling. And a missed Wednesday tends to reveal, with brutal clarity, which of those two categories a given habit actually belonged to the whole time. Picture someone who's built a habit of setting aside money every week, using a fully automated system with every piece of friction already removed. On paper, it should be foolproof. But the habit was adopted because a financial advisor once called it responsible, a fact absorbed intellectually, filed away, never actually felt. For the first month, the system runs perfectly because nothing has tested it yet. Then a genuinely hard week arrives. The transfer gets paused for one billing cycle, and something unexpected happens. Nothing. No pull to restart it. No sense of loss. Just a mild, forgettable gap that quietly becomes 2 missed weeks, then 3, because there was never a specific picture underneath the habit strong enough to miss. If that same person had built the habit around something concrete instead, finally being able to help an aging parent without the quiet dread that currently accompanies every phone call about her health, the missed week wouldn't feel like a technical gap in a spreadsheet. It would feel like an actual, specific loss, and that felt loss, not extra discipline, is what pulls a person back to the exact same action the following week. This is the part that reframes everything discussed so far in this video. Friction removal makes a habit easy to start and easy to maintain under normal conditions. But friction removal alone doesn't generate the pull that brings someone back after an interruption breaks the system anyway. That pull only comes from underneath, from whatever the habit was actually standing in for the entire time, whether or not the person doing it had ever consciously named what that was. Here's the uncomfortable question worth sitting with honestly, the same way this video has asked you to sit with everything else so far. Is the habit you're trying to build actually connected to something you can feel, specifically, in vivid detail, or is it connected to something you merely believe you're supposed to want, absorbed from someone else's voice, with no real foundation beneath it at all? Because a missed day will eventually test that foundation, whether you're ready for the test or not. And its honesty, more than any system or structure, is what actually determines whether you come back. There's a piece of this that most people get exactly backwards, and it's worth correcting before we go any further, because it quietly sabotages people who've actually done everything right up to this point. They assume the specific, vivid picture we just talked about has to arrive before the habit starts working. In reality, it's usually the other way around. Think about how most people wait to feel connected to a goal before they commit to the daily action required to reach it. They want the motivation, the clarity, the emotional pull to show up first, and only then are they willing to actually start showing up themselves. This feels logical. It's also almost exactly backwards from how the connection actually tends to form. Emotional investment in something new is rarely a spark that appears before action. It's far more often a byproduct that accumulates because of it. No runner feels the full weight of what finishing actually means before they've logged a single training mile. That weight builds gradually, mile by mile, week by week, mostly invisible until the race itself finally makes it undeniable. Someone who starts a habit for a fairly thin, uninspired reason, maybe just curiosity, maybe just because someone else suggested it, is often standing at that exact same starting line. If you'd asked them on day one whether this habit meant anything to them personally, they'd probably have shrugged. But 3 weeks in, something shifts, quietly, without any single dramatic moment marking the change. They start noticing small results. They start feeling a version of themselves showing up that they hadn't expected to like this much. The habit that began with almost no emotional weight attached to it has, through nothing more than repeated contact, started generating its own weight, entirely from the inside, built by proof rather than installed by inspiration. Hill noticed something messier and more useful than the usual advice about belief coming first. That persistence itself tends to generate belief, rather than only the reverse. Most people assume conviction has to arrive before the effort that follows it. What he actually observed was that showing up repeatedly, even without full conviction at the start, tends to manufacture its own results over time, and those results are what eventually produce the very belief people were originally waiting to feel before they'd allow themselves to begin. This matters enormously for anyone who's been waiting for a feeling before they start, because it means the waiting itself is often the actual obstacle. You don't need to feel deeply connected to a new habit on day one for that connection to eventually become real. You need to survive enough uninspired days for proof to start accumulating, at which point the connection tends to arrive on its own schedule, built from results instead of manufactured from nothing. Picture someone who commits to a habit of writing for 15 minutes each morning, not because of some deep creative calling, but simply because a friend recommended it, and it seemed harmless enough to try. The first 2 weeks feel almost mechanical, closer to an obligation than anything meaningful. There's no dramatic breakthrough, no sudden clarity about purpose. But somewhere around week 4, without any specific day marking the change, something shifts. They reread an early entry and notice, with genuine surprise, how much clearer their thinking has become on the page compared to where it started. That noticing becomes its own kind of fuel, entirely unavailable on day 1, because it simply hadn't been earned yet. This reframes something worth taking seriously about the entire question of finding your why before starting anything. For a lot of people, the search for a compelling enough reason becomes its own form of procrastination, an intellectually respectable way of postponing action while feeling like meaningful progress is still being made. The uncomfortable truth is that the reason often shows up after the action starts, not before, revealing itself gradually through the accumulating proof of actually doing the thing, rather than arriving neatly packaged and ready before day 1 even begins. So the real permission this gives you is smaller and more immediate than most people expect. You don't need to solve the emotional depth of a habit before you're allowed to start it. You need to start, honestly, even from a thin or uncertain reason, and trust that repetition itself has a way of manufacturing the very connection you were waiting to feel first, provided you survive long enough, through enough unremarkable days, for the miles themselves to do what no amount of thinking about the finish line ever could. There's one more piece of this that deserves honesty instead of the usual glossing over, because everything covered so far assumes you're running this race mostly alone. You aren't, and the people around you will have more influence over whether you finish than most people ever account for. Think about what happens to a runner's pace when they're surrounded by other runners moving at a certain speed. Something automatic kicks in, almost involuntarily. People speed up around faster company and slow down around slower company, often without consciously deciding to do either. This isn't weakness. It's simply how humans calibrate effort, constantly, against whatever environment they're currently standing inside of. And the people closest to you function as that environment for every habit you're trying to build, whether any of you ever acknowledge it directly or not. Here's what makes this especially relevant to the exact failure point discussed earlier: the missed day that turns into a missed month. When that interruption hits, the people around you either make returning to the habit feel normal and expected, or they make abandoning it feel like the obvious, understandable thing anyone would do in your position. Neither reaction usually comes from malice. It comes from whatever pace the people closest to you have already normalized for themselves, consciously or not. Picture someone rebuilding a habit of saving money consistently, surrounded mostly by people who talk about money the way exhausted runners talk about quitting, half joking, but not really joking, about how nobody actually gets ahead anyway, how discipline like this rarely pays off, how the whole effort probably isn't worth the sacrifice. Every one of those comments, individually, sounds harmless, even funny. Repeated often enough, they function exactly like a slower pace group, quietly pulling effort downward without a single overtly discouraging word ever being spoken. The habit doesn't collapse from one conversation. It erodes from dozens of small ones, each barely registering on its own. Hill insisted that a person's thinking gets shaped by the minds around them whether they consent to it or not. Not through anything explicitly said, but through a kind of pace absorbed constantly, at a level beneath conscious awareness, regardless of whether anyone nearby intends to be shaping anything at all. He wasn't suggesting people cut off everyone who doesn't share their exact ambitions. He was pointing at something more specific, that the pace of the people nearby becomes, gradually and without permission, the pace that starts to feel normal. This doesn't mean the people around you are working against you. Almost nobody normalizing a slower pace is doing it on purpose. They're simply running their own race, at whatever speed feels sustainable to them, and that speed leaks into every conversation whether either of you notices it happening. The distinction worth making isn't between people who support you and people who don't. It's between people whose own pace happens to reinforce the habit you're building, and people whose pace, entirely without malice, quietly makes stopping feel like the more reasonable choice. There's a specific kind of awareness this calls for, not suspicion of everyone around you, but an honest accounting of which conversations leave the habit feeling more possible afterward, and which ones leave it feeling faintly ridiculous without either of you ever saying so directly. Even one relationship that treats your consistency as normal rather than remarkable can do more for the habit's survival than a dozen conversations that quietly suggest, in tone rather than words, that giving up would be understandable. Because there's still one more layer beneath all of this, one that has nothing to do with systems, missed days, or the people around you. Something quieter, and in some ways harder to face, that determines whether any of this actually holds once the early motivation of hearing it wears off completely. Here's that quieter layer, and it's the one most people never get around to examining honestly, because it doesn't feel like a system problem or an environment problem. It feels like a permanent fact about who they are, which is exactly what makes it so easy to leave unexamined for decades. Go back to the marathon one final time. Every serious runner knows a strange, counterintuitive truth about the final mile. Some people, close enough to see the finish line for the first time, actually slow down without meaning to, right at the exact point they should be speeding up. It isn't exhaustion. The body has more left than that. Something else happens instead, quieter and harder to name. Right as the outcome stops being theoretical and starts being real, measurable, about to be recorded permanently. Some people build systems that remove every possible friction, connect to a purpose specific enough to survive interruption, and even surround themselves with people running at the right pace, and still find themselves quietly sabotaging consistency at almost the exact same point every single time. When that happens, the problem usually isn't the habit at all. It's what the habit is secretly threatening underneath the surface, in a part of the mind that has nothing to do with discipline. Think about what consistency actually promises if you follow it far enough. If you show up every single day for a year on something that matters, you'll almost certainly become someone different by the end of it. More capable, more visible, more responsible for what you build next, because the excuse of inconsistency simply won't be available to hide behind anymore. For most people, that promise sounds purely appealing. But for a specific subset of people, buried underneath the desire for that outcome, there's a quieter, more uncomfortable fear attached to it. Not fear of failing, but fear of what happens if this actually works. Picture someone who has spent years explaining a stalled career, a modest income, an unfinished project, by pointing to inconsistency as the reason. I just never stuck with anything long enough. That explanation, uncomfortable as it is, comes with a strange kind of protection built into it. As long as inconsistency remains the story, the actual ceiling of their ability never gets tested. Now picture that same person 11 months into the exact habit this video has described. Friction removed, purpose specific, environment supportive, closer than they've ever been to finally proving the old excuse wrong. And there, in month 11, an unfamiliar kind of tiredness shows up, seemingly from nowhere, just specific enough to justify skipping a few days that turn into a few weeks. Nothing about it feels like sabotage from the inside. It feels like a legitimate need for rest, arriving at a suspiciously precise moment, right before the ceiling would have finally been tested for real. This is precisely the layer Hill was gesturing toward when he wrote about the fear of success as something distinct from the far more commonly discussed fear of failure. A fear so rarely acknowledged directly that most people who carry it don't even recognize its name when they hear it. He observed that some men sabotage their own momentum right at the exact point real results were about to arrive, not from carelessness, but from something closer to self-protection, flinching away from a version of themselves they weren't yet ready to be seen as. If you notice yourself repeatedly breaking a habit right around the moment, it would have started producing visible, undeniable results, not randomly, but suspiciously close to the exact same threshold every time. The honest question worth asking isn't about willpower at all. It's whether some part of you is more comfortable with the story of almost than with the exposure of an actual, measurable result that can no longer be explained away. There's no need to resolve this fear before you're allowed to continue building consistency. Naming it honestly is usually enough to loosen its grip, the same way naming any pattern in this video has already started loosening its grip on you tonight. But it's worth knowing it exists, quietly, underneath everything else, because the closer you get to actually finishing what you start, the more likely it becomes that this exact fear shows up right when you'd least expect it, disguised as sudden exhaustion, disguised as a good enough reason to skip just one more day than usual. So let's talk about what actually happens on the other side of that fear, because everything covered so far has focused on removing obstacles, friction, interruption, thin motivation, quiet self-sabotage. There's a different question worth asking now. What does someone actually become, specifically, once consistency stops being a daily struggle and simply turns into how they operate? Every marathon has a stretch, usually somewhere past mile 22, where seasoned runners describe something strange happening to their own sense of who's doing the running. The legs are still theirs. The effort is still real. But something about the identity behind the motion shifts, almost imperceptibly, from someone trying to become a finisher into someone who simply already is one, still moving, with the outcome no longer genuinely in question even though the miles haven't run out yet. That shift doesn't get announced. It's simply true, a little while before the runner consciously catches up to the fact that it's true. You don't become consistent because you decided, once, that you're a consistent person. You become a consistent person because you kept showing up long enough that the label finally became accurate, retroactively, built from evidence rather than declared in advance. This distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it means identity isn't something you claim at the starting line. It's something you earn, somewhere around the middle of the race, without ever formally announcing the moment it happened. Think about the specific texture of that shift once it actually occurs. In the beginning, showing up required a decision every single day, weighing whether today was worth the effort, negotiating with resistance, choosing the habit over its alternative each time, as if the outcome were still genuinely uncertain. Somewhere later, without a specific day marking the transition, that negotiation simply stops happening. Not because the person became more disciplined in some abstract sense, but because the action stopped requiring a decision at all. It became something closer to identity than behavior. The way a person doesn't decide, each morning, whether they're the kind of person who brushes their teeth. They just do it, because the question of whether to do it stopped being a live question a long time ago. Hill wrote about habits eventually becoming fixed in the subconscious mind, no longer something a person actively does, but something they simply are. A transition he considered the actual finish line of this entire process, more meaningful than any single external result attached to it. Strip away the language of his era, and he was describing exactly this. A runner who stopped counting steps because counting stopped being necessary a long time ago. Picture someone deep into the exact system this video has described, looking back at an old version of themselves who used to negotiate every single morning about whether today would be the day they finally skipped. That negotiation is simply gone now, and they can't point to the exact day it disappeared. What replaced it wasn't more willpower. It was a version of themselves for whom the habit stopped being a choice and became, instead, a fact. The same category of fact as their name or their handwriting, something that doesn't require daily reaffirmation to remain true. This is where the actual reward of consistency reveals itself, and it's different from what most people expect going in. The reward was never simply the external result, the money saved, the pages written, the pounds lost, the skill built. Those results matter, genuinely. But underneath them sits something more permanent. Proof, collected day by day, that you are someone who finishes what they start. That proof doesn't just apply to this one habit. It becomes evidence available to you the next time you attempt something hard, something uncertain, something that would have once required borrowing confidence from somewhere else. Now it has its own source, built from your own track record instead of anyone else's opinion of you. There's a specific kind of settled confidence that comes with genuinely crossing this threshold, and it's worth naming clearly because it's easy to miss if you're expecting something louder. It isn't triumph, exactly. It's closer to an unannounced steadiness that no longer needs to convince anyone, including the person carrying it. That confidence wasn't given to them by understanding the mechanism this video has described. It was earned by whoever actually finished the race, one unremarkable mile at a time, long after the excitement of the starting line had worn off completely. Here's something worth understanding about what happens after that identity actually settles in, because it isn't the end of the story, even though it might feel that way after everything covered so far. The wall doesn't disappear once you've crossed it the first time. It simply moves further down the course, waiting at a new mile marker, calibrated to whatever you've become capable of by then. Think about what happens to a runner who trains hard enough to finally push past their old, familiar wall at mile 20. The obvious assumption is that the difficulty is now behind them for good. In practice, something different tends to happen. As their capacity grows, so does the distance they're willing to attempt. The person who once struggled to survive a single marathon starts eyeing something longer, something harder, and discovers, somewhat to their own surprise, that a new wall exists out there too. Later, further, built for the version of them that didn't exist the first time around. The wall was never a fixed obstacle with a permanent location. It scales with whoever's running toward it. This is precisely what happens to consistency once it becomes identity rather than daily effort. The specific habit that once felt like the entire mountain, the savings transfer, the morning pages, the workout, eventually stops requiring the same fight it once did. But the mind that built that consistency doesn't stay confined to the habit that trained it. It starts noticing other areas of life where the same mechanism could apply, and it starts running into new versions of the same resistance, at a level it couldn't have handled a year earlier, simply because it hadn't built the capacity yet to even attempt it. The principle underneath this is one Hill kept returning to in different forms, that the actual skill built through consistency was never really specific to the habit that trained it. It was a transferable instrument, sharpened through repeated use in one place until it became available almost anywhere else. He wasn't suggesting a single habit automatically carries over into every area of life. He was pointing at something more precise, that the ability to keep showing up regardless of how you feel that particular day becomes a kind of currency, spendable on the next hard thing and the next one after that. Picture someone who spent a year building the exact exercise habit this video has described, friction removed, purpose specific, pace protected by the right company. A year in, that particular morning routine barely registers as effort anymore. But something else has changed alongside it, something they didn't anticipate when they started. They noticed themselves applying the same mechanism to a harder, more uncertain goal entirely unrelated to fitness. Finally, starting the difficult conversation they've avoided with an estranged sibling, showing up to it the same deliberate way they once showed up to an early morning run, treating the discomfort the same way they learned to treat a missed workout, as data, not verdict. The wall at this new mile marker is real, and it's harder than the one they crossed a year ago. But they're no longer approaching it as a beginner. They're approaching it as someone with a full year of proof that walls, specifically, are the kind of thing they know how to get past. This is worth sitting with honestly, because it reframes what this entire video has actually been building toward. The goal was never simply to become someone who exercises consistently, or writes consistently, or saves money consistently. Those are just the specific terrain this particular race happened to be run on. The actual prize, underneath all of it, is becoming someone who has proven to themselves, through direct and repeated evidence, that they are the kind of person who finishes what they start, a fact that doesn't stay contained to one habit once it's actually been earned. So the question worth carrying forward from here isn't only, will I stay consistent with this one thing? It's larger than that, and considerably more useful. Once this particular wall is behind you, what's the next one you'll finally have the tools to run toward? The one that's been waiting, quietly, for a version of you capable enough to finally attempt it? Before we get to the end of this, there's one honest thing worth saying that most videos like this one skip entirely, because it doesn't sound as inspiring as everything covered so far. None of this makes the race easy. It never claimed to. Here's what's actually true, and it's worth hearing plainly instead of dressed up as something gentler. Removing friction doesn't remove effort. It just makes the effort sustainable instead of exhausting. Finding a reason specific enough to survive interruption doesn't mean the interruption won't still hurt when it happens. Surrounding yourself with the right pace doesn't mean you'll never feel the pull toward a slower one. Every single principle in this video reduces resistance. Not one of them eliminates it. And the honest reason that distinction matters is because so many people quietly abandon consistency not from lack of understanding, but from a private, unspoken disappointment that doing everything right still didn't make it feel effortless. Think about what actually separates people who sustain this long-term from people who understand every single concept covered tonight and still eventually stop. It was never that the first group found a version of consistency with no friction left in it at all. It's that they stopped expecting the friction to disappear completely and started measuring success by something more honest instead. Not, does this feel easy yet, but did I show up today, regardless of how it felt? That single shift in what you're actually measuring changes almost everything about how sustainable the whole effort becomes. This connects to something Hill was careful never to romanticize. Even while writing about persistence with real conviction, that sustained effort was never meant to stop feeling like effort. He described persistence as a quality built specifically for conditions that remain difficult, not as a reward that eventually makes difficulty disappear. A tool built to handle resistance only proves its value in the presence of resistance. Take the resistance away, and there was never any need for the tool in the first place. Nobody who's ever finished a marathon describes the last 6 miles as easy. They describe them as survivable, which is an entirely different quality and a far more honest goal to actually aim for. The runners who quit around mile 20 aren't usually the ones in the worst physical condition. They're often the ones who expected, at some point, for it to stop being hard. And when it didn't, they read that ongoing difficulty as proof something had gone wrong. Instead of proof, they were simply still running the distance they signed up for. Picture a woman a year and a half into a habit she built using everything covered in this video, still occasionally negotiating with herself some mornings, still sometimes feeling the specific pull towards skipping, still, on certain days, having to consciously choose the habit over its alternative rather than gliding through it automatically. From the outside, someone unfamiliar with what real consistency actually looks like might assume this means the work isn't finished yet, that something is still broken. It isn't. This is what consistency actually looks like at 18 months, at 5 years, probably for the rest of a life spent doing anything that matters. The friction shrinks. It doesn't vanish. And expecting it to vanish completely is often the exact thing that makes an otherwise sustainable habit start to feel like failure on the days it simply feels like effort. This is the reframe worth carrying into everything that's left to say tonight. The mark of someone who has genuinely mastered consistency was never the complete absence of resistance. It was the quiet, unglamorous willingness to keep running through resistance that never fully disappeared, mile after mile, long after the story of this should feel easier by now had stopped being something they needed to believe in order to keep going. Which leaves exactly one thing left to say, the thing that actually determines whether any of this becomes real, starting tonight, instead of joining every other video you've watched and quietly agreed with. Let's go back to where this started. A wall, showing up at almost exactly the same mile marker every single time, and a mechanism inside you deciding, in advance, how far you'd be allowed to go before it stopped you. You know now exactly what that wall was made of. Not weakness. Not a character flaw you've been quietly carrying since childhood. A depleting tank of decision capacity, running dry at a predictable point because nothing was ever built in advance to protect it. Friction nobody had removed. A purpose too thin to survive the first real interruption. A pace absorbed, without permission, from whoever happened to be standing closest. And underneath all of it, sometimes, a fear that had nothing to do with failing at all. A fear of what happens the day the excuse of inconsistency finally runs out. You also know, now, exactly what actually gets someone past that wall. Not more willpower thrown at the same depleted tank. A system, built in calm conditions, that removes the decision before the moment ever arrives. A reason specific enough to survive the day life inevitably interrupts it. The understanding that a missed day is data, not a verdict, and that the only real skill required is returning to the same small action as soon as the very next opportunity allows. And underneath all of that, the quiet, unglamorous truth that the friction never fully disappears. It only becomes something you've trained yourself to keep moving through anyway. You are not the same person who started this video believing consistency was simply a matter of wanting something badly enough. You've seen the mechanism. You know where the wall sits, and you know it was never a verdict about who you are, only a mile marker, waiting for someone who finally understood what it actually took to run past it. The next wall you hit, whenever it comes, will not feel like proof this doesn't work. It will feel exactly like what it is, a predictable, survivable stretch of a race you now know how to finish. Not because the difficulty disappeared, because you stopped expecting it to, and kept moving anyway. Every runner who has ever finished a distance that once felt impossible crossed that particular line the same unremarkable way, not with a final burst of inspiration, but with one more ordinary step, taken on a day that didn't feel special at all, immediately followed by another one just like it. That's the entire secret this video has been circling since the first block. There isn't a more advanced version of it waiting somewhere further ahead. There's only the next step, available to you right now, and the willingness to take it without waiting to feel ready first. Take that step today. Not perfectly. Not without the old tank threatening to run dry the way it always has. Just decisively enough to move 1 mile marker past the wall that used to stop you. Follow the channel if you're ready to keep running past this. And share it with 5 people who are still hitting the same wall, at the same mile, wondering why it keeps happening to them.